There is some progress being made. Are you, like me, surprised at how kind of easily this has all happened, if you like?
How easily what's happened, sorry?
Well, the lockdown. I mean, if you'd said to me a month ago, I think it was about maybe a month ago, you were due to come in to do Plank of the Week with us. You weren't feeling terribly well, so we didn't get to do that with you. But I was still, even as recently as 2 weeks ago, I was pretty certain that it wouldn't get to this stage. But here we are, and we're all kind of accepting it.
We are, for the time being. And, the government's strategy has been controversial. I think it's been misrepresented by some people. But part of the reason for not locking down at the drop of a hat was because they feared that people would get sick of it quite quickly. And if and when we are required to go into lockdown to deal with the second wave, the government was concerned that people simply wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
So I think from that point of view, the government strategy has been right, but we're at such an early stage still. We're going to be in lockdown for weeks and weeks.
Yeah.
And who knows what will happen come, I don't know, June, July, August.
Yeah, and we already have seen a couple of interesting things happening. I mean, yesterday, roundly condemned for it, as they probably should have been, Derbyshire police put a drone up and started telling people not to take their dogs for a walk in the Peak District, which appears to be a very uninhabited and quiet place.
Yeah, and this is the problem. This is why civil libertarians get very concerned about these kind of measures,
right.
Because the police don't necessarily obey the spirit of the law. I mean, perhaps they were technically right. People walking around the Peak District were not taking essential exercise, but what harm were they causing to other people?
Yes.
I mean, particularly when you compare it to people on the London Underground, as we just mentioned.
Well, exactly.
There seems to be a lack of common sense there, and people like myself are always concerned that if you hastily push through a load of legislation, that the police are going to interpret it in the worst possible way.
Are these the kind of teething problems that I suppose we would see, though? Because somebody else suggested to me that, why are the police sticking their heads into people's car windows to ask them where they're going when you're supposed to be staying 2 metres apart?
Well, indeed, yeah. And why is Jeremy Corbyn still going into Parliament when he's supposed to be self-isolating?
Well, he's not even meant to be leading the Labour Party anymore, really. So, I mean, it's about time he went home, isn't it?
Yeah, I think he's...
But he's not retiring. Make sure you don't make that mistake, because that's what Boris did, and he got very grumpy. But, I mean... What do you see? I mean, a lot of people are concerned that because we have relatively easily moved into this fairly sort of dictatorial situation with the government, that we may not actually come out of it in the same way that we went into it, if you know what I mean.
Well, it's obviously a big concern. I mean, I don't think any of the MPs have used this in a cynical way because they want to bring about a police state. Clear. I think the danger will come in a couple of years' time when this is all part of history, and you get various single-issue pressure groups looking back, looking at the evidence from this incredible natural experiment, and you'll have people, I think, saying, look at how much air pollution dropped by in London. Look how much greenhouse gas emissions dropped by. Look how much, let's say, crime dropped by. I think it's plausible that certain crimes, and probably overall crime, will decline over the next few weeks. Certainly burglaries are going to decline, I would have thought. And you'll get people who have a particular agenda saying, well, we don't want to bring about a full lockdown, but maybe there are elements of the lockdown we could introduce in order to deal with public health issues or climate change issues or whatever it is they're concerned about. We have seen this before. There have been quite a few public health researchers looking at the Second World War, for example, which was a dreadful time by any objective measure, but they quite liked the rationing aspect of it. They quite liked the fact that there wasn't very much obesity then, that food was more sort of evenly distributed. There was a study came out a few years ago looking at Cuba in the early 1990s when the economy completely collapsed and people were very hungry. And they ran out of oil, and so they had to walk more and all this kind of stuff. And surprise, surprise, rates of obesity fell. And apparently there was some improvement in heart disease mortality. And this wasn't portrayed as being a sort of a silver lining to a very big cloud. It was kind of, there are lessons to be learned here, And the underlying message, of course, is that actually deprivation and restrictions on liberties are actually a good thing in quite a lot of ways.
Well, I mean, when you see the behaviour of people fighting over toilet roll in the supermarket aisles, you do wonder whether people like that should even have the right to vote. I mean, that's always the way I'm left feeling. But I'm always a little bit nervous of looking at, what you might call dictatorships and going, but, the people are much more in order there than they are here. There's not as much crime in Dubai as there is in London. Well, that's fine. But, you also don't get sort of, your hands chopped off for stealing.
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, if you don't let people do anything, then the number of people doing bad things is bound to decline.
Yeah.
The problem is the number of people doing good things and doing things that they want to do in life also declines enormously. It's too big a price to pay.
Yeah.
I don't think we're leading inexorably to a police state by any means. These are clearly emergency laws, but history does tell us that emergency laws often spill over into peacetime. I mean, that was really the argument that Friedrich Hayek was making in 1944 when he wrote The Road to Serfdom, which is really the book that led to the creation of the Institute of Economic Affairs in the first place.
Yes.
He was very concerned that because the state had become much, much bigger in order to fight the war, that there would be people saying, well, if this works in wartime, it can work in peacetime.
Yes.
And basically, he lost that argument for several decades.
Right.
The government did intrude more into private industry, did nationalize all these companies, and of course it was a fiasco in the end. And from the kind of early 80s onwards, we tried to undo some of that damage. But that all did come from a feeling that we won the war because we've acted in effectively a socialist big government way, so perhaps socialism and big government is the answer to our peacetime problems.
Yes, I mean, that is a massive mistake to make, and obviously all the socialists are currently making it and going on about how, isn't it great that actually maybe Jeremy Corbyn didn't win the election, but everybody's now having to do what he suggested. Well, it's not quite that true, is it?
No, and it shows that they don't even understand socialism,
right,
as far as I can see. I mean, what the government's doing at the moment isn't really socialism. It's borrowing a huge amount of money. It's giving it to businesses and the self-employed and to workers to tide them over. But that's not anybody's serious idea of socialism. That's not what Karl Marx was talking about. The government isn't nationalizing industries, certainly at least not yet. The kind of measures that the government are putting through, the kind of borrowing that they're doing, is obviously totally unsustainable. I don't think any serious socialist would say that their dream society would involve the government borrowing £500 billion a year and just giving it to people while telling them that they're not allowed to work. So it's not even socialism.
No, it really isn't. Interestingly,
it's a fetishization of debt, which we've had now for over a decade. People just seem to think that the more money you borrow, the better society gets.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that even the Labour Party in the last election were very keen to make it clear that 95% of people would not be paying any more tax. The reality is, if you want more public spending, and certainly the kind of public spending that we're seeing now and that Jeremy Corbyn promised, people are going to have to pay more tax. It's not going to be a small percentage of the population. There simply aren't enough rich people in the country, and they don't have enough money. And if you try and tax them too much, they won't be in the country anymore anyway.
Right. But it's a worldwide situation, this, isn't it? Because we've seen the US putting, $3 trillion into the economy to keep it going. What's your view of the whole market situation? Because I was talking to somebody the other day who was suggesting maybe it's a good idea to actually shut the market down. Although just before I ask you to answer that, I'm just going to bring you a bit of breaking news, which is apparently Boris Johnson has tested positive for the coronavirus, Chris. So just when you thought that it was safe to go to Downing Street, apparently he's got very mild symptoms, but it'll be concerning for his partner, Carrie, because she's pregnant.
Absolutely. It'd be concerning for a lot of people in the Cabinet and the government and the House of Commons in general, I would have thought. Absolutely.
Anyway, we'll come back to that in a moment. What's your view of the market, the stock markets at the moment? Because there are some who think that it's wrong morally for them to be kind of basically, running the casino-like atmosphere that they run while all this is going on and effectively profiteering from it.
Well, are they profiteering from it? I mean, it looks to me like the stock market, anyone who's got stock market investments has done very badly.
Well, what I would say to you is my sister worked in Wall Street for many years, and she always said to me, whenever anything like this happens, the volatility always means we make money.
Well, there will be money to be made for people who are putting their money in, perhaps now or certainly over the next few weeks. There's bound to be a big rebound in the stock market, but it's fallen by something like 40%. Last time I checked, which I have to admit was a few days ago now because it's all so terrible.
Well, it bounced back a bit, I think, in the last couple of days, certainly in New York.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is bound to bounce back, and if people have got a bit of money in their pocket, I think the stock market is the best place to put it at the moment. Closing it down will obviously just stop that rebound, or certainly delay that rebound until much later. You need to be very careful about people talking about profiteering. I mean, it has no meaningful effect on the spread of the virus or any health conditions either way. People lose money, they make money. I think you'd have to have a serious kind of ethical question with people making money at all.
Yes.
To be too worried about the stock market.
Yes. No, sure, I get that. It's just that because everything else seems to be shut, and I know that it's much more automated now than it used to be, and so it's not quite as much of a casino situation as it was. From the point of view of sort of a libertarian, I just was interested in what you had to say, because in America, looking at the way that the states operate, because of the fact that, the federal government does not have control over every single state without an executive order, I'm told that Florida is still very much open for business, and they have not closed it down, and the kids are on the beaches celebrating spring break and hanging around with each other in a very intimate way, which is quite astonishing considering what's going on in New York.
It is, but America is a big place, you have to remember. It's not massively different from some country in Eastern Europe being open while the UK is closed down, it's a federal system. The other states, I guess, could restrict movement from Florida if they wanted to.
Yes, exactly right. So, what's your kind of best estimate of what happens after this? If we assume that we get past the worst of this, what do you think they'll do first? I mean, will they sort of suddenly say from Downing Street, "Okay, now you can go back to the pub," or "Now you can go back to work," or what do you think they're going to do?
I hope it's going to be the pub first. Obviously.
We'll all be desperate for a drink by then.
Schools a bit later. I would imagine they'd do it in kind of reverse order of the way they close them down, I guess.
Yeah.
So we'd be looking, hopefully, at opening the schools at some point in the summer term, reopening some of the pubs. There'd probably be big social distancing measures in place.
Right.
I mean, if you look at China, yeah, they have reopened a lot of things, but, for example, a restaurant that would previously have seats for 40 people now has seats for 20 people. There's a huge amount of social distancing remaining in place. So it would be very much a gentle and gradual process, and if the whole thing explodes again, they will, I guess, go into lockdown again.
Yeah, right. And as far as the sort of the trading business is concerned, I mean, there will be obviously some businesses that don't survive this, so I'm not quite sure how long that recovery then takes.
Well, this is why the government's £350 billion support package is so important. This is a very different situation to the Great Recession of 2008, and indeed every other previous recession. In your normal recession, you've got people running out of money. They're suddenly tightening their belts for whatever reason, and therefore businesses are struggling. They then start laying people off. Then you've got more unemployed people. They haven't got money, and it's a vicious circle. It's a very different situation here. In this instance, people have got money in their pocket. They would like to spend it. They're being prevented from doing so because the government has closed most of the shops in the hospitality sector. And those who remain on either their full wage or the 80% salary that the government is guaranteeing will presumably save up quite a bit of money over the course of the next couple of months. And when they are allowed to go back to their shops, we're bound, I think, to see a big bounce in spending. People will catch up with all the things they've been meaning to do. They'll get that haircut they've been desperately needing.
Yes.
They'll go to the pub to celebrate. So I would expect to see a very severe drop in GDP in this quarter and the next, followed by, if we assume, for the sake of argument, that we come out of this by the beginning of July, followed by a large increase in GDP, which won't be enough to make 2020 a good year overall, I'm sure, because there will be businesses that unfortunately die out, and not all money is going to be spent at the same level as it would be before. So the person who has a haircut is having one haircut rather than two, and they've allowed their hair to grow a bit more shaggier than they would have done.
Yes.
But it won't be as bad as you might think, and it is certainly not a long-term problem like a financial crisis is, or like a recession is.
No.
We're not trying to get more demand into the economy. In this instance, actually, it's the supply that's the problem. Once the supply is opened up, people should have money, by and large, to get back to normal. And come 2021, there's no reason for the government to be borrowing any more money than it intended to this year.
No, of course. Chris, thanks very much indeed. Make sure you keep yourself safe down there on the South Coast. Chris Snowdon there from the Institute of Economic Affairs.